Today we cover one of the most shocking scandals to hit academia, the rise and fall of Harvard professor Francesca Gino, from allegations of data fraud and plagiarism to lawsuits and whistleblowers. This story reveals the dark side of academia research and what it means for the future trust in behavioral science. So let's start with Francesca Gino. Who is Francesca Gino? What are her credentials and what was her reputation like before this scandal? Well, Francesca Gino was a tenured professor at Harvard Business School. She specialized in behavioral science and organizational psychology. She was really known for her research on decision-making, creativity, ethics in the workplace, and also, ironically, cheating. She was the author of Rebel Talent, Why It Pays to Break the Rules at Work and in Life, which received at the time very widespread acclaim. And she regularly consulted for organizations like Google, Disney, Walmart, and the US military. She was a sought-after speaker and consultant. Earlier last year, I recorded an episode on Francesca Gino's work with Richard Shotton. Richard had just released a book called The Illusion of Choice, and in it he mentioned her work on the red sneakers effects, which was a really interesting research. We recorded an episode on it, published it, but right before I hit published, the news about Francesca Gino broke, and we put a big disclaimer at the start. But you can go back and listen to that episode to get a gist of how important and how noteworthy her research was at the time. But that was all before the allegations of fraud. And all of this started in around 2018. This is really the origin of the case. And in this time, Zoe Xani, a PhD student, analysed a key paper by Gino on networking. And she discovered these inconsistencies which suggested data fabrication. So Xani was a PhD student in Paris, and she was conducting her dissertation. And she encountered this paper, which was written by Francesca Gino, which essentially claimed that networking made people feel dirty. This study was a foundational piece in the field. It was highly influential. It was heavily cited. But Zoe read this and basically found the conclusion, this idea that networking creates these feelings of dirtiness. She found that pretty implausible based on her own understanding of the topic. So she accessed the dataset used in Gino's study and began to analyze it. What she found very quickly was inconsistencies in the results. The numerical data and the word-based responses in the dataset didn't align. So, for example, while someone's score might say that they found networking to be very dirty or make them feel dirty, the actual words they used to describe networking were quite positive, like saying networking makes me feel empowered. It appeared to Zoe that some of the numerical data, which really found this result, that networking increased this feeling of dirtiness, may have been manually altered to produce statistical outcomes. The patterns in the data seemed highly irregular, and they suggested that they were fabricated. Zoe reported these concerns to her PhD supervisors, expecting a bit of guidance and support, but instead, they dismissed her concerns and they feared potential repercussions for challenging a prominent academic. They actively discouraged her from pursuing the investigation further and even pressured her to drop it entirely. But Zoe, she refused to be silent. She teamed up with an anonymous fellow researcher to dig deeper, and together they identified 3 additional datasets from other studies authored by Gino that exhibited similar signs of fabrication. Realizing her university wouldn't act, Zoe contacted Data Colada, a blog specializing in exposing research misconduct. Data Colada is run by 3 academics who really specialize in these issues and are fantastic at statistical analysis and figuring out data integrity. The researchers are Uri Simonson, F. Nielsen, and Joe Simmons. These researchers, they verified Zoe's findings through rigorous validation. They cross-referenced the sources, they looked at the statistical anomalies, they analyzed the metadata from the Excel files. This is something really interesting you can do. You can look at the calc change, and that reveals if someone has manually manipulated the data. And they concluded, after lots of research, that Zoe was right. The datasets were likely fabricated, and it pointed to deliberate fraud. Specifically, what they found were inconsistencies within the dataset. So, for example, the numerical and word data would be contradictory, meaning the 2 types of data did not tell the same story. So somebody saying that networking made them feel empowered, but then giving a score of 10 out of 10 when asked, how dirty did it make you feel? There were also statistical irregularities. So the p-values, which are used to determine the significance of results, were unusually low across multiple studies, suggesting that manipulation was used to make the result appear more robust than it actually was. And they also found these manipulated Excel files. Like I said, this is where the Excel file has been tampered with. And you can see this by looking at the calc chain, which is a file property showing the history of the edits. And they found, in some cases, that someone had manually altered certain cells in a way that was consistent with deliberate fraud. So, Data Colada took these findings with Zoe to Harvard, and in 2021, Harvard Business School, who obviously were the employers of Gino, they conducted a detailed investigation lasting 11 months and ultimately concluded that Gino had engaged in data fraud. Harvard's investigation identified significant misconduct across 4 papers spanning 8 years. Findings included that 28% of survey responses were manually edited to fit a hypothesis, that dummy responses had been added to final datasets, and some data, actually highlighted in grey, showcased this manual manipulation. We'll get onto that in a bit. It's kind of a funny aspect of this story. Anyway, the dean at Harvard acted on these studies. They placed Gino on administrative leave, and Data Colada published their findings to the world. Data Colada's findings were published over a series of 3 blogs. I've linked to their blog in the show notes of today's show, along with all of the other sources. I'll go into detail about each of these 4 papers because it's quite interesting to learn how this manipulation was done. So the first paper was the Sign at the Top study. This is a 2012 study titled Signing at the Beginning Makes Ethics Salient and Decreases Dishonest Self-Reports in Comparison to Signing at the End. Now this is a paper published by Francesca Gino, Dan Ariely, Nina Mazar, who's a previous guest on Nudge, Max Baseman, and Lisa Shu. The hypothesis is that signing an honesty pledge at the top of the form instead of at the bottom increases honesty in self-reports. This is something that I actually talked about on an earlier episode of Nudge. So in the study design, there's basically 2 parts of the study. One is a laboratory study held at the UNC, and the other was a field experiment involving an insurance company. So in the lab studies, participants solved puzzles and reported their own earnings, with financial incentives for correct answers. Honesty was assessed based on these self-reports, and they had a way of basically figuring out how honest people were. In the field study, real-world participants in a real insurance program reported their annual mileage after signing honesty pledges at the top or bottom of their form, and they saw how honest they were. But fabrication was detected, firstly in the field study. So the mileage data from the insurance company supposedly provided by Dan Ariely was clearly fabricated. Data Colada analysed the distribution of the reportage mileage, which showed an unnatural uniformity between 0 and 50,000 miles. So basically what this data was showing was that drivers were uniform in their driving, that there were as many people driving 1,000 miles as were driving 50,000 miles, which is of course wrong. Real-world data will form a bell curve, with most people driving around the middle of that range. But this histogram was flat, and it's a clear indicator of manipulation. When Data Colada reached out to the insurance company, that insurance company actually confirmed that their original data had no such effect. They did have a bell curve, and that again suggested that this was manipulated or fabricated data. And then there's the lab study data. Gino's lab study data contained many irregularities, such as outliers and implausible consistencies across groups. Evidence of manual tampering was found in the datasets, again by looking at those calc tables, and again the fabricated values aligned just too perfectly with the desired hypothesis. So that's the first study. The second study, how inauthenticity produces feelings of immorality and impurity. The study basically suggested that when individuals act inauthentically, so contrary to their true selves, they experience feelings of immorality and impurity, and the research suggested a psychological link between authenticity and moral behavior. Now, the reason this was retracted was due to Harvard Business School's investigation, but in the Data Colada blog titled Data Falsificada Part 2, My Class Year is Harvard, the authors in Data Colada start to highlight some of the problems with this paper. So the study involved 491 Harvard students who completed an online survey. The participants were asked to express an opinion on a campus issue and provided demographic information, including their year in the school. Subsequently, they then wrote an essay either supporting their own view or opposing their own view. So they were asked to support the view they had or oppose it. After this essay, the participants rated their desire for 5 cleansing products on a scale from 1, which is completely undesirable, to 7, completely desirable. The author's hypothesis was that arguing against one's own position would induce feelings of impurity and increase that desire for cleaning products. But there were problems with this dataset. Data Colada identified some peculiar responses in the demographic data, particularly in the year in school question. Now, while most students provide a typical answer, like I'm a junior or 2016 or third year in school, 20 participants entered Harvard as an answer to their year in school question. This is a nonsensical response to that question. And these 20 entries were clustered within 35 rows in the dataset, and it suggested potential data tampering. The analysis revealed that those 20 entries significantly aligned with the study's hypothesis. In the condition where the participants argued against their own position, all 20 respondents with that Harvard answer to the year in school question rated the desirability of cleansing products at a maximum value of 7. In contrast, in the condition where the participants aligned in favour of their own position, these respondents provided low desirability scores with only one exception. This pattern was highly statistically significant and disproportionately influenced the overall results, and it casted some very, very big doubts on the study's validity. These strange responses strongly aligned with the study's hypothesis, and it suggested deliberate data manipulation. It undermined the results and is probably the reason the paper was retracted. Now, the third paper is titled Evil Genius: How Dishonesty Can Lead to Greater Creativity. It's a 2014 paper, and it claimed that engaging in dishonest behavior could enhance creativity. The authors argued that breaking rules through dishonesty might encourage creative thinking by allowing individuals to think outside of conventional boundaries. Now again, this was another paper retracted by Harvard, and in Data Colada's blog post, which is titled The Cheaters Are Out of Order, we get a good idea of why this paper was retracted. So the study involved 178 participants recruited via Amazon Mechanical Turk. The participants first completed a virtual coin toss task, and this was designed to provide them with an opportunity to cheat. Subsequently, they engaged in a creativity task, specifically generating as many creative uses for a newspaper as possible within 1 minute. The hypothesis was that the individuals who cheated on the coin toss task, so said they got heads when they actually got tails, would exhibit greater creativity as measured by the number of uses for the newspaper generated. The report findings were consistent with the author's hypothesis. The study reported that those who cheated on the coin toss task generated more uses for the newspaper. On average, those who cheated came up with 8.3 uses, whereas those who didn't cheat came up with only 6.5 uses for the newspaper. But there were problems. Data Colada identified peculiarities in the dataset's sorting order. The data was almost perfectly sorted by 2 variables: cheated and number of responses. Among the 135 non-cheaters, the data was perfectly sorted by the number of responses. However, among the 43 cheaters, 13 of the observations were out of sequence. This irregularity suggests that the dataset may have been manually altered with after sorting to produce the desired effect. Now, by inputting the out-of-sequence values to fit the expected order, Data Colada found that the significant relationship between cheating and creativity disappeared. This indicates that without the suspected data manipulation, there would have been no significant difference between the cheaters and the non-cheaters in terms of their creativity. The anomalies in the dataset's sorting order and the disappearance of the significant results upon correcting these irregularities suggests more deliberate data manipulation. It undermines the credibility of the findings and raises significant concerns about this research. Now, the final paper was titled Why Connect? Moral Consequences of Networking with a Promotion or Prevention Focus. This study examined the moral implications of professional networking. It suggested that those individuals who were primed with a promotion focus, so those who wanted to seek advancement in their career, well, they might view networking as more morally acceptable compared with those with a prevention focus, those aiming to avoid losses. Again, this was retracted by Harvard, but Data Colada in their final blog, titled Forgetting the Words, shed some light on why it might have been retracted. Now, this study involved 599 participants who were assigned to one of three conditions: a promotion focus. So these were participants who wrote about their hopes and aspirations and were primed to be thinking about promotion. Again, priming has some real problems in behavioral science. So whenever you see a paper about priming, always question it. And this is obviously one that you should question as well. Anyway, the first group were primed to be promotion focused. The second group were primed to be prevention focused. They wrote about their duties and their obligations, so this primed them to hopefully avoid losses. And then there was a control group. These were participants who wrote about their usual evening activities, and that was designed not to prime them in any way. After the writing task, the participants imagined attending a network event and rated their feelings of moral impurity. For example, feeling dirty, tainted, or inauthentic on a 7-point scale. Now, the findings in this study reported that the participants in the prevention-focused condition felt significantly more impure about networking events compared to those in the promotion-focused condition. This aligned with the author's hypothesis. However, Data Colada noticed some problems. The first was that there was an unusual distribution of scores. In the prevention condition, there was an unexpected abundance of participants with an average impurity score of exactly 2.0 or 3.0, suggested that many participants rated all 7 impurity items uniformly with 2s or 3s. This pattern was not observed in the other conditions and is statistically improbable. There was also a mismatch between the ratings and the descriptive words that participants used. So participants provided words to describe their feelings about the networking event, and this is included within the data. And yet, in several cases, there was a severe discrepancy between the words that they used to describe networking and their impurity rating. For example, some participants gave a rating which suggested they did feel dirty, saying 7 out of 7 on the scale, saying I feel impure by attending networking events, but then they would use words like empowering or advancement when describing how they actually felt about networking. There was a real contradiction between the ratings they used and the descriptive words. These anomalies suggested that the data may have been manipulated to produce the hypothesized effect, specifically altering those impurity ratings in the prevention condition to higher values would artificially create the reported differences between the conditions. So Data Colada had gone through all of these studies and caught the fraud. They used advanced statistical analysis, they cross-referenced with replications, they looked for data sets inconsistencies, and they actually took direct reports from some of Gino's collaborators. So other whistleblowers, other co-authors came out and have flagged concerns about the data handling. Now, since Data Colada published these findings, all 4 of those Gino papers have been retracted. Harvard's investigation placed Gino on administrative leave and suspended her without pay. And it's actually had wider implications. It's raised serious questions about the data integrity and accountability in behavioral science and highlighted the role of external watchdogs like Data Colada. And you think the story might end there. You would imagine that Gino would accept these claims, move on, try and clear her name by publishing better research. But that's not what happened. Gino didn't agree. She denied the wrongdoing. She has consistently denied the accusations, claiming that she did not commit academic fraud. She created a website, Francesca versus Harvard, to present her side of the story. Yet while all this was happening, additional allegations of plagiarism, actually from Francesca Gino's public books, also emerged, and this further undermined her credibility. So these plagiarism allegations, they were identified by Erin Ackland, a Montreal-based postdoc. She investigated Gino's work out of curiosity, and the first instance of plagiarism was found in the opening sentence that Erin examined. So the specific example is from Rebel Talent. This is the book Gino wrote. And Gino wrote that rule breaking does not have to get us into trouble. If done correctly and in the right doses, it can in fact help us get ahead. Erin found that was direct plagiarism from another site. Science magazine then took these claims and did a major investigation into all of Gino's books. And they found multiple examples of plagiarism. So, for example, in Rebel Talent, Gino gives a description of Milan's fashion quarter. She names different streets, luxury boutiques, describes ivy-covered walls and miniature fountains. And yet, in 2014, 4 years before the book, there is an identical description of Milan's fashion district, including the same street names and specific imagery like ivy-covered walls on an English-language travel website about Milan. And then there is Gino and Ariely's book chapter from 2016 from the book Dishonesty Explained, and that too had evidence of plagiarism. So Gino's text said specifically, and I'll read it out, compliance with these values and norms results in internal rewards, e.g. feeling good about yourself, whereas non-compliance results in internal punishment, e.g. feeling bad about yourself. That's what Gino published in this 2016 book. But in 2014, Jasper Beineveld published his thesis, and it said this: compliance to these values and norms results in internal rewards, e.g. feeling good about yourself, whereas non-compliance results in internal punishment, e.g. feeling bad about yourself. That is direct plagiarism, and again, in this example, there was no references to Jasper's work. And then there's, again, another example from Rebel Talent. This is the Toy Story 2 story. Now, Gino summarizes the Toy Story 2 story with near verbatim language used describing Woody's arm injury, his kidnapping, and his meeting with Jessie. And Rector magazine in 2017 gave an almost identical plot summary with the same key details and phrases, like doomed to spend the rest of their lives separated from children by thick glass. Again, it looks like direct plagiarism. There's her book Sidetracked in 2013. In here, she has an example of Ken Olsen and the DEC. She recounts this story of this company, mentioning its dominance, the rise of Sun Microsystems, and the use of the Unix operating system. And yet, there is a Forbes article from 2011 that provides an almost identical narrative. And finally, there's again another example from the book chapter I mentioned in Dishonesty Explained, and it summarizes the Milgram experiment. Gino describes the Milgram experiment, including the progression of shocks, signs of distress, and conclusion about authority and obedience. And yet, a paper from 2008 contains the exact same descriptions and conclusions using highly similar language and citing the same references. These examples, according to science, and really anybody who reads that blog article, which I've linked to in the show notes, well, it demonstrates both direct textual overlaps, structural similarities, and a consistent pattern of plagiarism. Now, all of this plagiarism raised additional questions about the integrity of her larger body of work, including her wider academic research. It suggests a pattern of taking liberties with facts and content, not citing people properly, and it has some contextual irony as well. Gino's books were marketed as guides for innovative thinking, creativity, breaking rules, and yet she wasn't following those rules herself. She was copying and plagiarizing and not using her own innovative thinking to write her work. Now, while all of these allegations of plagiarism was going on, Francesca Gino filed a lawsuit against Harvard Business School and the 3 whistleblowers from the blog Data Colada. The lawsuit accused the whistleblowers of defamation and causing reputational harm by alleging fraud in her work, and she also challenged Harvard's handling of the allegations against her. Francesca Gino's lawsuit against Harvard and Data Colada initially sought $25 million in damages. Specifically, she claimed defamation. She argued that the public blog post tarnished her standing in academia and beyond. She claimed for emotional distress and financial losses, saying that the accusation had led to emotional harm and substantial economic losses, including the suspension of her tenured position at Harvard Business School, which she claims cost lost opportunities and diminished her future earnings. And she made a discrimination allegation against Harvard. Gino argued that Harvard treated her more harshly than other faculty members accused of misconduct, implying potential gender bias in the handling of her case. Now, what's interesting is you can really clearly see what side the public was on, because while all this was happening, a GoFundMe was set up to help Data Colada cover the legal costs of being sued for $25 million. The campaign received overwhelming support, quickly surpassing its fundraising goal, and quite clearly showed that Data Colada was being supported by the public, and that the public really wouldn't want to stand up for these lawsuits against whistleblowers who are quite clearly trying to do the right thing. Anyway, this case rumbled on for many months, but then in March 2024, before the case was closed, Harvard released their report. This was following some legal motions and pressure from organizations like The New Yorker, and this was Harvard's initial investigation into the allegations of data fraud by Francesca Gino. It's 1,300 pages long, and it indicated a really comprehensive and thorough investigation. The report essentially confirmed the evidence of data manipulation in Gino's work. It highlighted the anomalies and inconsistent data sets and suspicious p-values, including the signs of manual tampering, all the things that Data Colada mentioned. Now, in Gino's defense to this, she claimed that she was manipulated by others, even accusing a former co-author, which Pete Gino in his fantastic YouTube video on this topic says maybe Nina Mazar. But these defenses were deemed as implausible by Harvard. This report further damaged her credibility and was also praised for its rigor and transparency. It set a precedent for how institutions should handle academic misconduct. And finally, in October 11th, 2024, a federal judge dismissed the defamation claims filed by Harvard Business School against Francesca Gino. The court ruled that the criticisms that Data Colada made were protected by the First Amendment, and they emphasised the importance of open critique in scientific process. However, the judge did allow Gino's breach of contract claims against Harvard to proceed, so there are still some parts of her lawsuit which remain active. But the court dismissed the defamation claims against Data Colada, and it's really reinforced the view that the Data Colada researchers acted in good faith and well within their rights to critique publicly available research data. Gino's reputation has been irreparably damaged. The plagiarism in her books has further discredited her academic integrity. The case has really highlighted the importance of protecting whistleblowers and maintaining rigorous standards, and it's raised some scary questions about how much we can trust science. Freakonomics, who did a fantastic episode on their podcast about this scandal, which of course I've linked to in the show notes, had some interesting reflections. Max Brazeman, who was one of Gino's co-authors in one of the papers I talked about earlier, he acknowledged that he was a bit naive in trusting colleagues, but he does say that trust in science is crucial for societal progress. That said, the episode notes that there's a bit of a believability crisis in social sciences due to this fraud. Danny Kahneman was quoted in expressing a shift from believing surprising findings to immediately approaching them with skepticism. Joe Simmons, one of the 3 Data Colada authors, has described the incentive structure for academia as broken, and he advocates for systematic changes to prevent future data fraud. But there's a paradox in all of this. The paradox is that by exposing all these flaws, all these problems with science and peer reviews and books by prominent researchers, that exposing these things temporarily harms trust in science. But the paradox is that it ultimately strengthens the field. Science earns trust not by claiming authority, but by showcasing self-correction. And I think that's the point I want to end on today, which is a positive point. It's this idea that if science can self-correct itself like it has, we should look at a scandal like this, not with fear and as a reason to sort of disregard the whole world of behavioral science, but instead as a way to trust it more. In his book Nexus, Yuval Noah Harari talks about self-correcting mechanisms. He says self-correcting mechanisms are necessary in order for society and civilization to progress. He gives a few examples. The economic example, like market supply and demand. Free markets are able to adjust imbalances through pricing. When demand exceeds supply, the prices rise, reducing demand and incentivizing more production. It's a great example of a self-correcting mechanism. Democracy is a self-correcting mechanism. It allows for self-correction through elections, enabling citizens to replace their leaders or policies. In a democratic election, unpopular leaders can be voted out, and this can address the problems, the grievances in governance. And I think this Francesca Gino case is an example of self-correcting. It's a positive example of how whistleblowers can call out misconduct, can call out fraud, and ultimately improve all of our understandings of social sciences, behavioral science, and marketing psychology. Failure and setbacks aren't the problem. It's the ability to learn from these mistakes that is important. Now, I want to end today's episode with some book recommendations. Now, I wouldn't recommend reading this book by Francesca Gino for obvious reasons, but I do have 25 books that I think you should read. These are books that will help you improve your business, improve your marketing, and just general psychology tips to improve your life, your productivity, all these things as well. Every single one of these books is backed by scientific evidence in peer-reviewed journals, and I think it's evidence you can trust. It's not just anecdotes or lies in other cases, but included in my reading list, I've also included 5 books you should avoid, so you should know what you should not be reading as well. If you'd like to download this reading list, just click the link in the show notes below, enter your email, and I will send you the reading list completely for free. So do go have a look at the 25 books I would recommend you read in 2025. Cheers.